Good afternoon and welcome to this Joan Smith Centre Power Hour event, and let me also welcome all those people joining for the first time and those who are watching again on our YouTube channel and on our website. The Joan Smith Centre exists to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we do that in three key ways. We do that through research, and we've just published 3 reports recently looking at the issues around trust and public servants. We do it through advocacy, organising events like this to showcase the very best of politics, and we also do it through structured internships in an attempt to break down the barriers that so many young people face accessing politics and public life. This Power Hour series is designed to take a different aspect of power in each session and explore it with a special guest who is excelling in their own chosen field. This afternoon, we're looking at the role of think tanks and how they shape public policy, and we're going to do that with Torsten Bell, who is the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, which is the UK's leading living standards think tank. In the next 60 minutes, we're going to look at Torsten's early career before looking at his current work and his hopes and fears for the future. Throughout this session, we want to hear from you, and you'll get more out of it the more actively involved you are in it. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to Torsten, either about his background or his work, feel free to type it into the Q&A section at the middle bottom hand side of your screen, and we'll be able to see those questions here at the centre, and we'll field them appropriately throughout the next 60 minutes. So please do get involved, and we're going to start off by learning a little bit more about our special guest, Torsten. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Tell us, what did you study when you went to university? How did you decide what you were going to be when you grew up?
Well, those are 2 different questions, and if anyone really knows what they're going to be when they grow up, there's something very suspicious about them. But I'm boring on that sense. I studied economics and a bit of politics, but mainly economics at university. And then did a bit of international relations, a bit of international economics after that for a master's.
Where?
At Oxford.
At Oxford. Where did you grow up school-wise? Were you always political? How did you know economics was going to be your thing?
So I was born in London, and until I was about 10, and then the parents fled, as everyone did, as they get to their 30s and 40s, and fled out to Kent. And so I went to school in a Kent town. And there wasn't a lot of politics around, if I'm honest. You know, those are all very safe Tory seats. They're not contested. There's no, big elections aren't really a big things there. So I wouldn't say that was a big feature of life, but like within family, there are people that, like my grandma in particular, was very into politics, into talking about it. Well, politics is wrong, into campaigning. She wasn't into political parties per se, but she was into making change. She was a school teacher over in the West Country, and at that point around Hereford, Cheltenham, Ross on Wye, those kind of places.
So you go to uni, and what kind of student were you?
What kind of student was it? I had a really great time at uni, actually. I played a lot of football. I edited some student newspapers. That was great fun. I ran the company that edited some student newspapers to bring the books back into line. I'd spent the time before I went to university, I went to earn some money doing something that sounds very dull, working as an accountant, doing some auditing work for 6 months before I went to uni to bring in some cash, basically. But the side benefit of that is I learned a lot about accounting, which I thought wasn't useful, but actually when I rocked up and the student newspaper was going bust, was incredibly useful. So the lesson here is always worth knowing some accounting.
Were you political at uni? Is that where you found your politics?
Again, not massively party political. No, at university I was, as I say, mainly running newspapers, magazines and things. I ran a student campaign on fees for a while, for maybe about a year, but I didn't stand for elections into student unions and the like, no.
Because a lot of people who maybe do the type of job that you do now do get involved in their Labour club or the university Conservative club. That wasn't for you. You were playing football.
There's a lot of that around, and lots of friends were in my case, in the Labour club at university. I think I was actually technically a member, but no, it wasn't a big part of my day-to-day life. My day-to-day life was, as I say, hanging out with my friends in college, playing football, and then spending a lot of hours till like 4 a.m. making newspapers exist.
So why aren't you a journalist?
I'm not very good. It turns out I really like designing newspapers, and I did write a lot of stuff, but I would not say I'm definitely not the best writer. In fact, my wife did become a journalist briefly afterwards and used to be horrified by the text that would emerge from my pen. So no, I'm not very good at it. And I like I like policy and I like politics a lot more than writing. But I do miss, this is sad, but I do miss designing newspapers. They're beautiful things. And the death of newspapers, I don't want to sound like a total old fogey here, but the beauty of a well-designed newspaper is a sad loss as we all move online in our readings. It's not the biggest problem. The pandemic is just above this in the order of problems, but it is a big disappointment to me that you can't make a job in designing newspapers anymore.
We'll maybe explore some of that in the later sections if we've got time. So what happens when you graduate? What happens next?
There's no grand plan. I didn't have I've been offered a job doing kind of boring stereotype management consultancy stuff, and I put in for the civil service. And I'll say I wasn't massively keen on any of it. I was actually in Sweden. I have a bit of Swedish family. I was in Sweden. I think this must have been the summer. It must be immediately after graduating, actually. And the civil service rang me up and said, or emailed me or something and said, we'd like to offer you a job. Would you like to do this job in, I think it was in HMRC. Anyway, I said, no, it sounds incredibly boring, but thank you for the offer. So I didn't actually really have a plan. And then maybe a few weeks later, they came back and said, okay, how about this job in the Treasury? And I said, okay, I'll do that. But it definitely wasn't part of a cunning plan. I was just on the lookout for interesting thing to do. I was in that phase of talking to people, seeing what was out there. So I definitely did not have a life plan. But it was a really nice first job. Lots of lovely people to work with.
I mean, not many people get their first job working in the Treasury. I mean, that's a hell of an achievement. Did you kind of appreciate at the time how grand a job that was? Or what were you doing in the Treasury? How do you start off there?
Yes, it was definitely, it's not a usual place to start work, but lots of people do, lots of young people join it every year. Like the rest of Whitehall's problem with the Treasury is that it's too full of young people. And they don't know anything, and they come around bossing us around. So that would be the general view within Whitehall. It's a great place. I mean, the individual job I was doing wasn't that exciting. The first job in the Treasury, you just got a job, and it's good to learn how the real world works. I always say to people, your 20s is basically learning, having your expectations of the world of work crushed as you realise that it's actually less exciting than everyone said. And it turns out that there are some big, restrictions on what you can and can't do. So but no, my main thing was, I learned about the world of work in the way that we all need to do, and got to work with some really lovely but also impressive, clever people. Got to work on some really interesting issues. Most of my first job was mainly on the tax side. Some of it on bits that didn't go down very well. I can remember that we'd started losing big tax court cases. You won't remember this because it never got to big public attention, but we basically kept losing these court cases that were costing us billions of pounds, like Vodafone and a few others, where tax litigation was becoming a much bigger deal and companies were basically taking the piss. And I was like in the team that dealt with tax compliance in the Treasury, i.e. tax avoidance. And I remember going along, and so people senior up started worrying because they suddenly started noticing that this was costing real money, billions, not just a few hundred million. As I went along to this meeting with our lawyers, who at that point were is now Somerset House. Well, it was Somerset House, but is now a posh skating ring and stuff, yeah? And where all the cool kids hang out when there's not a pandemic on. Well, at that time, it was a rat-infested, disgusting office next to the Thames, which hadn't been updated in about 50 years. And our poor lawyers were stuck in there, two of them. They'd obviously been doing it for a very long time. And they were obviously having to face off against like 50 incredibly well-paid private sector lawyers. And I remember thinking to myself, the public sector is going to have a hard time here. So those kind of things were the first things I started doing. And then I moved off to do public spending, lots of things, lots of stuff on devolution, lots of stuff on, all kinds of areas. It was great. And as I say, the main thing about when you're early in your career is working in interesting places where you learn a lot, and importantly, working with nice people, because they're the best people to learn from, and they're the people that you build up your networks and your friendships with.
So time-wise, what we're talking here, is this early 2000s?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
It's the early days of a Labour government trying to do vastly different things.
Sorry, so university's early 2000s. No, so this is by the time I'm turning up, it's post-Iraq has definitely happened. So the shininess is gone, and we're into the competence, and there wasn't much opposition still, but not into the popularity time, basically.
Gordon Brown's Chancellor?
Yeah, when I turned up, Gordon Brown was Chancellor, and he was definitely the Chancellor, I can tell you that, of the Treasury. The man was definitely a very visible figure in the Treasury, and then he obviously transitioned. I think it must have been about 18 months or a year after I turned up, he transitioned across to number 10.
you're a young civil servant in the Treasury, how much of power do you see? How much contact or close to politicians do you even get?
That varies hugely depending on the role.
Okay.
So in my first job, none, like almost none. Probably some, but like almost none. As in, you might write some submissions, like bits of advice to ministers. You're trying to make processes keep ticking along, get decisions taken. But at the same grade, somebody, the second job I did was, it wasn't a promotion, it was just a different job working in a minister's private office. And then once you're doing that, then yes, every day is about, helping make sure that the machine of government keeps moving along. And then you're seeing that, then you're spending much more of your time with politicians. So it's very different for different people.
And life changes quite significantly for you when Alistair Darling becomes Chancellor, is that right?
Yeah, it was shortly after. Mainly what happened is that the financial crisis started, you'll remember. So I can remember the early years in the Treasury, but I'm absolutely honest. I remember thinking to myself, there's a slight danger here, which is that obviously the Labour government had basically decided what it thought about economic policy. Like it wasn't really, it was not in, loads of more money had been spent. The big ideas like tax credits had been done. And there weren't loads of new economic thinking. There's a reason why when Gordon became Prime Minister, a lot of what he talked about was the Constitution. So when the financial, and I was slightly worried that there wasn't going to be that much, that many interesting big policy things to decide. But actually what happened was a financial crisis started. So the first bank run in 100 years turned up in September 2007. And so that then totally transformed the work that everybody was doing in the Treasury. So even if you weren't working on the banking side, every decision that's being made about tax and spend is then in the context of a big economic recession going on. All the work suddenly is on, I was then working on unemployment, how to keep it down, a thing called the Future Jobs Fund, the likes of repossessions. We were very worried about repossessions happening, although they never did because interest rates never got up again. So the work totally changed. And then about halfway through that crisis phase, I think I was in the office. You're working most weekends, obviously, because the world was ending broadly. And I was in the office, I think it must have been, we were nationalising a bank. I can't remember which one. I think it might have been Bradford and Bingley. And I got a message from Alistair saying, will you come across to the flat in number 11, which isn't, the flat in number 11, by the way, is not as glamorous as people, I think, hope that it would be. Anyway, but so I went, and also remember, it was actually the flat in number 10, because at that point, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor had split. But anyway, to avoid confusing things. And so I went across to have a chat with him, and he basically said, he said, I'm going to offer you a job, but you should not take this job, because you will probably lose it again very fast. And it's not sensible when you're young to lose your job. So he offered me a job still doing pretty similar work, but instead of being a civil servant, becoming a special advisor, an economics advisor to him as the Chancellor. Anyway, so I said yes, despite his warnings.
So that is really interesting. Why is a special advisor different to being in the formal civil service in the way that you previously were?
I mean, there's lots of differences. I mean, you're a personal appointment by the politician rather than being part of a big, human resources, normal business structure. It's very different in terms of the kind of work you're doing. So in my case, most of the work was on the kind of technical policy, economics side of things. But some special advisors work full-time on comms, for example, might just be doing, press work. Others will be more worrying about the kind of Labour Party facing side of things. But, the main differences are, in lots of ways, one, you are personally tied to a politician. You are helping probably to make things happen a bit more across Whitehall rather than worrying about individual bits of policy, making sure that the way that you're working with number 10 is all working along. The departments know what the Treasury is and isn't going to agree to do. So that's quite different. And then obviously the point Alistair was making when his don't take this job is that if your politician goes, then you lose your job overnight as well. So that's different. But when you're young, I was footloose and fancy free at that point. So that wasn't as scary.
Well, I was going to ask you about your youth there, because I'm guessing at that moment in time, you probably became your boss's boss. Was that hard?
Well, I mean, Alistair was still the boss of everybody at the building. So it didn't feel like that. I mean, in retrospect, yeah, I've got enough self-awareness. Yes, I was young. So I think I was young, and I think that was just luck. That was completely luck about being around when people needed particular skills and particular work done. But yeah, I think probably for people that were older than me in the Treasury, that probably for some. But remember, it was a bit easier for me because I basically did know everyone before that happened. So if you come in from the outside into the Treasury and you're very young and you don't like know how it works, have respect for the institution, I suspect it is quite hard. So that's a bit easier in the sense that, you know, everyone was used to me by then anyway. But I definitely wasn't. Remember, you're a special advisor. You're no one's boss in the sense that you're not line managing anybody. So you know, none of that. There was none of those issues. So you're definitely not your boss.
You have authority and power. You've definitely got authority and power.
You have some, yeah, but hopefully you're not enough of a numpty to wield that. I mean, one thing I definitely took away from politics in all phases of my career is people that enjoy the bit of institutional power, which is basically throwing their weight around inside institutions, inside the civil service. They like, you know, lots of ministers of both parties that treat their civil servants badly, or you see it sometimes inside political parties where people treat the staff in the political party badly. You'll have heard all the bullying rumours across all of the parliaments across the UK. Those people, in my view, are just bad at getting things done. Like it's immoral anyway, but it's also just a really ineffective way. So like, you know, the ways of getting things done in institutions are to learn how they work and to not, if you are lucky enough to have elements of power, in my case, you know, only insofar as people thought that what I thought might be what Alistair wanted. So it's not because of who you are, it's because of your boss. But then yeah, you don't throw your weight around to do that. You behave well, I hope.
So you run into the 2010 general election as a special advisor in the civil service, and then Labour lose. What happens next?
Well, something happens in between, which is the election. So you stand down as a special advisor. Well, normally you do. There's a few people that, for some reasons I never quite understand, try and cling on during the election period. But yeah, so I stood down about, you resign about, maybe it was 2 months out from the general election and move into Labour HQ. And then to help run bits of the campaign. It wasn't the most fun campaign, 2010 of all time. Highlights included Mrs. Duffy and many others. So so we went off to do that. And there, you know, it's a different way of working, but a lot of the issues you're working on are the same, to do with, you know, policy, what's in the manifesto, what's not, what are you saying about the issue of the day, those kind of things. I'd say more of that feel is a long. I mean, election campaigns, you learn a lot very fast. It's basically full-on work for several months. And then we lost. Although remember, it was blindingly obvious we were going to lose. I mean, like, governments don't win after 13 years in power. It's a general rule of life. They definitely don't win after the largest recession in like 50 years and 13 years in power. So but the actual result was obviously much closer than any of us expected, which is why we ended up with a coalition government. So that went on for a while afterwards as well. Remember, there was these 5 days of faffing around before we decided who was actually going to form the government. So you couldn't actually move out of number 10 and number 11 until you'd got a new prime minister.
So what do you do? What happens next?
What happens next is that in the short term, again, I wasn't in massive rush to, you know, I was absolutely exhausted. I mean, I slept for like, you know, several days without end, basically. And then I owed Alistair, obviously. And he had to stay on as the shadow chancellor for a while Labour had its leadership election. So I promised, you know, I owed him. So I said I would help him out doing that and that ran until the autumn, I think. And then a mixture, against my better judgment, I was talking to people, I was thinking about going off to work for housing associations, actually, to do something a bit just completely different for a while. But when the new leadership turned up in the autumn, I don't want to say guilt tripped, but there was a lot of pressure to stay around. So I did stay around. So I did another 5 years. So I did government and politics in government, and then I did 5 years working for the Labour Party in opposition.
You were head of policy for Labour?
Head of policy for yeah.
So people kind of understand that as a job title, but they're not entirely sure what that means that you do. How does an opposition party even go about developing policy? Because a lot of people would assume that that's something that's done democratically at conferences, that party members decide policy. So what's your day-to-day look like?
That is an excellent question. Now you're asking me to remember the depths of time after several trauma sessions. Sure. I shall try to give you an accurate memory of what it is like. I mean, I'd say there's at least 3 like elements to it. There may be 4, but one of which is probably the one that people have in their head normally. So the policy directorate does some things that look a bit like government. So they do insofar as there is like longer term policy thinking, what's going to go in the manifesto, what are we actually proposing should be done. Then you have people that work on that. So that takes up a good chunk of your time. Then you have the kind of more just day-to-day of politics, which is there are bills coming through, there are decisions to be made. What are you saying about the thing in the news that day? So there's kind of policy, but in a kind of rapid form, which is less about long-term. Hopefully it's informed by what you think about the long-term, but it's really just, can you take lots of decisions very fast, because there's just so much going on. Then there's a third bit, which is the bit you're talking about, which is the internal party democracy. So I can't speak for all the parties, but all four of the main parties in Britain now have like fairly well developed, less so the Conservatives, but well developed systems of party kind of democracy on policy. Those are really important things. Politicians take those seriously. Members take those really seriously, particularly in the Lib Dems. So there are teams. There were teams working for me whose only job was to basically make sure you're servicing that, making sure the meetings are happening, making sure decisions are getting taken, making sure people are being consulted. All those kind of things are going on. So there's a lot of different chunks of it, and then there's the kind of personal support to politicians. They're making speeches. They're trying to, they want to like bounce their own ideas around and things. So there's quite a lot of that as well. So there's, the advantages are it's very varied. The downsides are you can never ever do justice to everything that's meant to get done.
So from 2010 to 2015, Ed Miliband's leading the Labour Party across the UK, and he's perceived to have what might not look radical in 2020, but at that time was considered a pretty radical centre-left prospectus for using the power of the state to take on some really big challenges. And it feels like a lifetime ago now, but one of the big issues at the time was energy prices and rising energy prices. And when you read back on some of the bold policy ideas of that time, you're largely credited, along with a couple of other people, of coming up with the energy freeze idea. Can you talk a little bit about what the analysis was of the problem and how you came up with that as a solution and the type of work that goes into that?
God, now you are definitely stretching my memory. So it's definitely a team effort on the policy side. I mean, I think the focus on energy per se is driven by three things. One is Ed's background in energy policy. He'd been the energy and climate change minister in government, in the cabinet, before he became leader of the Labour Party. So he knew a lot about it, cared about it, thought about it quite a lot. Two, that there was a phase basically of high energy prices. So the politics of energy prices, mainly on the back of gas and oil prices being high, was definitely there. So people were seeing big price rises. But remember, the more important bit is that was against the backdrop of living standards being very bad, full stop. So the living standards issue encapsulated by one subset of that issue is the price of energy. And him being interested in it is why that was the issue focus. In terms of the policy detail, the work on that policy was definitely more detailed than the internal work, obviously not the published work, but the internal work was more detailed than I think probably than almost, maybe not the most, but more than almost any other policy work done in opposition by us during those 5 years, because like you say, people thought it was absolutely mad, and that you would do anything to intervene. And so, we wanted to make sure we are absolutely certain about what we thought was going on. And broadly, remember, the price freeze was the temporary fix, and then with reforms of the market to make sure the problems that meant you needed the freeze had been addressed for the medium term. So you wanted the long-term policy, and then you had the token, the bit that people could kind of latch onto as the main public-facing element of the policy.
So, I mean, what you're describing there is a really good example of analysing an issue like falling living standards, using the expertise of a leader and his authenticity on a particular issue, and coming up with a policy which you can then sell. We've got a couple of questions coming in, people asking about how you factor in kind of the real lived experience of voters into how you communicate a policy like that, and who's doing that work? How do you make this real for people rather than it just feel like it's a policy drawn from a spreadsheet?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's actually different in opposition maybe than government is that that's easier in some ways, because if I'm honest, everyone always says politicians, they're really out of touch. Well, maybe some, but actually politicians do a lot more talking to people and the public than almost anybody else around the world. So the issues that they're interested in they are not a bad guide. I'm not saying ever, like, politicians definitely care about train fares more than most of the population.
Yeah.
They used to spend their time on trains before they were all locked down. But generally, like the energy price thing was coming from the fact that the public were talking about it. It wasn't coming from politicians. It definitely wasn't coming from any spreadsheets. In fact, in general, my view is that if you just rely on, anyone that relies on spreadsheets to know what's happening in short order will struggle. So I'll give you an example. Like there were loads of spreadsheets out there telling you that home ownership for young people was falling as long ago as 1989. Yeah, the spreadsheets were clear. No one started talking about it in politics until 2003, 4, basically when the overall home ownership rate started falling. That is less of a problem. I mean, there are also even if you don't believe the politicians are in touch, which obviously they're not perfectly in touch, but there's a whole host of professionals in party politics that spend their lives doing focus groups, talking to the public, making sure, and they'll be testing kind of, how does the idea sound, but also what does it make people think about the party? What does it make them think about individual politicians? Do they think it can be done? Yeah, and one of the things that has changed in politics is that the public now may well think, if you just poll them on an individual policy idea, they may well think it's a good idea. If you then tell them that a politician is proposing it, the policy will be a lot less popular. That is one of the changes that's happened over the but I think that is a bit, insofar as people say, oh, politicians have no idea what's going on, that I think that is from people that haven't spent a lot of time with politicians. They tend to be very attuned to what the public is saying, maybe, which is a good thing. That's what democracy is about.
I think your last example there about polling probably speaks to a lot of the 2019 experience, but we'll park that for a moment or two. We want to move into just looking at the role of think tanks and lobbying more generally in a second, but just a final question that's come in about the energy price freeze was, you must have faced a lot of backlash from vested interests, and by that they mean the big energy companies and the suppliers then. I'm guessing there was a bit of political work to do there, but also some legal work as well. Did you ever feel like it was going to be a policy that would fall apart under scrutiny?
So it was definitely legally complicated, and we've done a lot of legal, background planning and things, and you definitely need to do that with any big policy. And yes, it was very, there was a lot of people very angry about it, although as you say, in retrospect, everyone saying that it was Marxism has now learned their lesson, I suspect. Like I remember talking to chief executives of, FTSE 100 companies in the run up to the 2015 general election, where they would say, well, some of this stuff is just like a massive risk. It's a different way of doing our capitalism, to which I would say it's a tiny change. And by the way, the other lot are going to have a referendum on the EU. So where's your balance of your risks in how big changes are? So I think it was a lesson in how much some people will fight, even things that are basically negligible change, really, taking the big picture. But I think one of the lessons people have learned, I would hope, is that if you don't collectively kind of improve your capitalism, then you can't expect public support for it to continue. So I think the business attitude has definitely changed since when I was doing the job you're talking about. Now people are actually much more ready to step back and say, what's the actual problem? And are there any answers? Not just to look at the proposed solution and say, well, I don't really want any change, so I don't like that. But yeah, no, there was a lot of people very angry about it. But I mean, you get used to that. You get used to it in politics. You don't want to be if you're proposing stuff that is just things that everyone likes, then you're probably not proposing very much.
And in retrospect, a lot of what you were advocating for in the 2015 general election became David Cameron's policy, became Conservative policy at a later stage.
If it didn't become David Cameron, then it became Theresa May, or if it didn't, we're now in England, we're now introducing slowly but surely concessions for rail travel rather than franchises. Grant Shapps is announcing that. That's basically what a Labour government after 2015 would have done. So yeah, slowly but surely, was it everything? Was it, if definitely, there were definitely big limitations and errors and lots of things. But yeah, I'd say the public consensus on the policy, not necessarily on the politics of what a post-crash world looked like, but on the policy agenda has basically on the economic side moved in that kind of direction over time. And I think that's cross-party consensus now. I think that's good. And, Tory ministers coming to talk about that kind of stuff is really good and valuable.
So fast track through the 2015 general election, the EU referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, up to kind of more present day times. And you're now the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation. Do you want to tell us in 60 seconds what the Resolution Foundation is all about under your leadership?
Sure. So, I mean, as you said at the beginning, we're an economics think tank that works on issues that matter to the living standards of people on low and middle income. So we will only work on issues if they're economics. So we don't work on like the weeds of public service delivery. We're not experts on that, and we wouldn't try to be. We work on issues that like directly impact people's day-to-day living standards. So most of our work is in the tax and benefit area, the labour market, jobs, skills, housing. And then some things which are harder to, the last decade has taught us matter a lot for our living standards, like macroeconomics. How do you stop big recessions becoming deeper recessions? Those kind of things, where we took a decision a few years back that they mattered so much to living standards that even though they were less kind of directly visible for the public about how they affect their living standards, we needed to do work in those areas. And then in terms of, so like having that issue selection, I'd say compared to most think tanks, we have a more narrowly defined, this is our purpose. And then in terms of ways of working, I always say the same two things to the team, which is the foundation needs to, everything we do needs to combine rigor and purpose. So it needs to be right. The only reason anyone cares about what the Resolution Foundation says is because we have expertise and we make sure that we are providing them with information about what's happening in the world or what could happen that's based on rigorous research. So we don't do, we rarely take funding from other people to do work. It's all, and has to be academic level rigor, and then it has to be clearly in line with our purpose. So it has to be contributing to improving the living standards of low and middle income families. We're not just doing it, we're not academics. We're not doing this because it's just, I personally find it interesting to work on this area. It has to be delivering on the purpose of the organisation.
So if people follow you on Twitter, they'll see that you quite often do some very quick, very sharp, instant, real-time analysis of economic trends or things that are developing. How do you prioritise between doing that work and kind of stepping back and looking at mega trends and trying to anticipate the types of issues that might require public policy response in 18 months' time?
Well, at one level, that on a day-to-day basis can be a challenge if something's happening right then, but you kind of had carved out that day to do some proper thinking. But actually it's not, I would say the tension is not actually that big. And the reason for that is that the people that have interesting things to say about the stuff that's happening quickly tend to be people that have spent time thinking about the state of the country. Like basically, to be able to usefully add value to what's happening on the day, you have to have built up the intellectual property. So I say, we're an independent think tank. Nobody cares what we think because we're not friends with any particular politicians. We make absolutely certain we work with all parties, and so the only reason people are interested in us is because we think things, even if they don't agree with them. And so, as I always say to the team, our job is to do the thinking, build up the intellectual property about what we think about the state of the country. And then when issues are coming up day to day, everything we do is applying what we've done before to what is happening that day. So I'll give you an example. Working from home is now today is the issue of the day. And so we'll be talking about it, but we'll be talking about that informed by thinking about how people work, where people work, different sectors, how work from home, and that's all based on longer term work. So that to be good at the day-to-day stuff, my view is that you can only do that if you've done the longer term work. And actually you should basically focus on the day-to-day stuff where you do have something to add because you've built up that intellectual property, decided what you think, have something to say that is actually useful, interesting, evidence-based. So someone just does something and we've never worked on it and we don't have lots of data and we haven't got anything useful to add, we will ignore it. But if something's happening and journalists are interested in talking about it and politicians are having to think about what they think about something, and we have previously thought about that, well then that's the time when we will decide to focus on the short term.
Another tension people might think exists is how you respond in what might be seen by the government of the day in a negative fashion towards a particular aspect of public policy versus your desire to try and influence what happens next. Is there a tension there? If one day you're slagging off the furlough scheme, the next day you're trying to offer an alternative to the powers that be. Does it feel like that, or are people more grown up and they don't respond in that way?
I think it's probably easier for us because, as I say, we're not, we're not trying to be friends with anybody. We're just saying, it's two things. One, we're not trying to be friends with anybody from any party, any particular government. We're just trying to say, this is what we think. But the difference is we will only say what we think if we can provide the evidence to stack it up. So my view is, insofar as the Resolution Foundation is able to have impact and to influence discussions, it's because we have something to contribute to the conversation. It's not because people think or say nice things about them. And we make absolutely, like, we don't get involved in any of that stuff. We don't get involved in politics. We don't get involved in, saying this particular politician's doing really well. We only get involved in the issues. And as I say, we will only say things based on what our research says. So that, which is, I get, is easier for us in some ways, because that's what all of our, it's a building stuff full of, well, not a building anymore. It's people's flats stuff full of lots of talented researchers doing that kind of economic research. So that's what we all say. And I think basically people are adult enough to know that even if you didn't agree with them on policy X, they'd still like to know what you think about policy Y, because they want to know what, they know there's some expertise out there. And, the British public policy space is not so rammed with lots of, high-end research that people, don't want to hear it if it's available. So I think it's about knowing that what's important is knowing what you think, that is based on evidence, not just on kind of personal views, and that you will say that clearly, and that will be the basis for what you criticize and what you support, rather than people thinking, are you their friend or not? That isn't what we do.
So you've emphasised there, the building up of the intellectual property, the importance of doing your homework and having the kind of research readiness there so that people can draw from it. But talk to us about the furlough scheme, because as prepared as someone might be, I'm not wholly convinced you had a policy on the shelf ready to show a Conservative government how it might need to support upwards of 8 million people in employment. So the pandemic starts, does the phone ring and the Chancellor's on the phone to Torsten Bell saying, any ideas about what to do here? Can you talk to us about what that was like?
I'm hoping he's a bit busy for that. No, so you're completely right that, we definitely, it's not like we were proposing a furlough scheme before a furlough scheme was needed. I would say two things. One is knowing what you think about kind of social security systems, how they can work, the interaction with the world of work generally, in particular learning from British past and learning from other countries which do have schemes that look a lot more like a furlough scheme in normal times, is important background. So the intellectual property background still matters, even though the question changes. And then I'd say the thing that mattered, the reason we came to the furlough scheme as a proposal is thinking through, so my view, which is mainly based on living through the financial crisis, is that the big job of economic policy, when a recession, something that's causing a recession happens, is everybody focuses on the symptoms of the problem. So they focus on like the unemployment, the repossessions, the bad stuff that happens in recessions. And policy needs to do a lot to ameliorate that, help people keeping their jobs. But unless in general, the job of policy is also to deal with the thing causing the recession. You've got to get to the root cause of it. And if you don't, then it doesn't matter what you do on the other stuff, because the uncertainty just keeps blowing around. So I'll give you an example. In the financial crisis, you do need to help people keep their jobs, help people with homelessness, all the usual stuff. But you also needed to sort out the uncertainty about banks' balance sheets. So that's why we recapitalized the banks, because you needed to reassure everybody that the uncertainty about whether the banks were going to fall over was no longer an issue, basically. And similarly, if you look at the 1990s recession, that was about an exchange rate problem. We'd set a policy for an expensive pound versus the Deutschmark. People didn't think that was going to hold. Removing the core problem in the end was getting yourself out of the exchange rate mechanism. And so you've got to deal with the underlying problem. Now, the reason why, insofar as we added value, I think it's helping people think through that the underlying problem in this recession is unique because it's not an economic problem. It's a virus, it's a pandemic, and you can't make it go away with economic policy. So you then think, well, what is the bit of the problem we can deal with? And the bit of the problem you can deal with is the uncertainty. The public facing huge uncertainty about whether they'll have a job tomorrow. And if they think they might not have a job tomorrow, then everyone will stop spending immediately. And you end up with an even deeper recession. Plus that the nature of the crisis is that you're asking people to, take a lot of pain to help us save lives. That's what a lockdown is. And if you're going to do that, you're going to have to protect their livelihoods, because otherwise they're not going to do it, as we're about to find out. If you want people to quarantine, you've got to pay them to quarantine at home, if they can't carry on working at home. So I think insofar as we added value, and insofar as what got us to propose the scheme as we did, which is broadly as the government implemented it, broadly, not quite, but then it is the background in what are the options out there from different social security systems around the world. And secondly, forcing people, like, because in the middle of a crisis inside government, it's really hard. You're basically just thinking there's just loads of bad stuff going on. You're trying to just firefight day to day. And there's not a lot of space. And I can promise you this from the financial crisis, to step back and say, what is the underlying problem? What is the nature of this crisis? Which there's much more space to do in think tanks. And so there, I think that is where our kind of value added came this time.
There's a lot more on the pandemic that I want to explore with you in the final 20 minutes, which we're creeping up to, but there's just been a couple more questions coming in more generally around the role of think tanks in society. Do you think there are enough of them? Are they well spread enough across the political spectrum? Should they be more accountable or more properly regulated? Should people have to tell us more about how they're funded? What's your hot take on all of that?
So that's a lot. I mean, there's lots of good think tanks out there. My view is, I don't think we're like at saturation point. I think in particular, my view is that what's changed over the last 20 years in think tanks is that they have gone from there's less market and less of a role for kind of clearly politically aligned think tanks that are like basically just trying to come up with whizzy ideas, and that where, you know, almost how interesting the idea is as important as like, has it had lots of detailed research on it? So like the early 2000s, there's lots of think tanks making news by just being like, here's a wacky idea. Okay, one of the effects of like everything being really tough for the last 15 years is, I think think tanks to be heard have to have much more expertise than they did then. Plus obviously data is just much more available. That what you can do in a small organization with data has kind of been completely transformed over those 20 years. So I think it's become, you've got to have more evidence than you used to have. I think there's more market for non-politically aligned think tanks. And I think there is, I think there's still lots of space there. I think, you know, for diversity reasons, if nothing else, there's like 3 big economics think tanks in the UK sphere. I definitely think there'd be room for more than that area. Like particularly, there's not, for example, one that works in detail on the data about what's happening to British business. So like we work a lot on what's happening to households. We work on the government finances. We work on all kinds of things. But there's definitely a gap for something that's focused almost explicitly on British business. On the health side, there's some quite large think tanks, well funded with big endowments. But on the education side, there's not. If I look up in Edinburgh, there's nowhere near enough. There's not, given what we've not seen alongside the devolution of lots of power to not just Edinburgh but to Cardiff too. We have not seen the growth, a big enough growth in expertise and think tanks around those areas of policy. We've still got 2 generalist organisations, not enough expertise, and they tend to be too closely tied to some of the politics as well. So we find it hard to say what they really think, basically, because their finances are precarious, basically. So I think I'm in favour of more and more diversity. And on funding, yes. I mean, I don't think it's that controversial. People should just publish where all the money comes from. So we're very lucky. Ours comes from one big endowment that our founder put in place, ages ago. And most of our funding comes from that we draw down on, and where we receive external funding, where there's a project that we think is a really valuable thing to do. If it's within our remit already, and there's no pressure in terms of what the conclusions are, then we'll publish who paid for that piece of work, or maybe they contributed towards the cost and didn't pay for it all. So yeah, I don't think it's rocket science. We should just publish it all.
Thank you. That will please Reese Harper, who's specifically asked you to address that question. Moving into the final chunk, Torsten, I mean, there's so much we could explore around the pandemic, but one thing that struck me today, and is probably relevant to students that are watching, is what all of this means for unemployment in the future, and in particular youth unemployment. And I'll explore youth unemployment with you in a second, because I think we both know, or everybody watching will know a lot about the scarring impacts that youth unemployment can have. But before we get to that, a question about data. So even today on the Resolution Foundation Twitter feed, you've identified 2 different predictions about just how bad unemployment can get, one from the OBR and one from the Bank of England, that are vastly different. How can that be? What's going on there? And how do you use that in a public policy sphere?
So the first thing to say to encourage some sympathy towards policymakers at the moment is that the uncertainty is massive, and the uncertainty in all economic crises is big, but this time it's particularly big because it's not just the economic uncertainty, it's the pandemic spread uncertainty. So the 2 are overlaying each other. So the path of the future is particularly hard to see. So like you say, one example of that is how big is, like, I don't think anyone doubts now we're going to see a big rise in unemployment this autumn. How big it is very hard to predict. So the Bank of England is predicting something like just under 8% unemployment by Christmas. Remember, we're currently around 4%, so that's a doubling. The OBR back in July predicted something more like 12%. Now, so that's like huge. That's kind of the highest unemployment we've seen since the 1980s. So in a generation, basically, that's mass unemployment that Britain has kind of, there's been way too much after the financial crisis, because the unemployment didn't rise as far as people thought it would, I'd say, and we've seen record employment in the last 5 years or so. I think there's been complacency that you could never see mass unemployment again. So now now those numbers are very different. So that's like 1 million people more unemployed under the OBR scenario than the Bank of England's. Now, my view is that the Bank of England is more likely to be right on the technical, like in terms of what's going on, but both are horrendous. And policymakers, it's not just, they haven't got to just decide which of those they think are right, because the honest answer is there's not one that's right, there's just a balance of probabilities. And then you have to decide, well, given that you think it, even if you think the Bank of England's spot on, but there's a chance the OBR is right, well, given how bad we know unemployment can be for the economy and for the individuals concerned, well, then your policy may want to aim at tackling the bigger problem, even if you think that might not turn up, because you've got to have a policy that's fit for that uncertainty. You can't just have a policy fit for exactly what you think is the most likely scenario.
And if you are that decision maker, when you're looking for policy solutions, is the motivation just to get that unemployment rate down as fast as possible? And therefore you might look at the business end of that, how you get people that are just one step removed from the labour market back in it. Is there an issue about, once again, neglecting those people furthest from the labour market in public policy? And does that change depending on which government's in power? Are the Tories more or less likely to care about long-term youth unemployment than perhaps a Labour government might be?
So I suspect all politicians care about the problem. Youth unemployment is definitely, nobody wants to be in government when youth unemployment is high. The nature of this crisis means that like in all recessions, we see youth unemployment rising faster than overall unemployment, because they tend to be let go first, or the first in, first out idea. In this crisis, that has been combined with the fact that the sectors that have been hardest hit are the ones young people work in. So retail, hospitality, these are the, when I was a kid, when I was like late teens, where was I working? I was working in pubs and restaurants. That's where young people work to get there, learn about the real world. And so when those are the sectors being shut down, it's low earners and it's young people that bear the brunt. So I think everyone wants that to come down and knows they need to do something about that. And the issue you raise is totally right about how do you have a calibrated policy response that makes sure that some people that are just flowing out of work, you can get them back into work as quickly as possible, but doesn't then ignore people for whom that's a bigger reach. And one of the things we learn is that when we spend time with periods of high unemployment in Britain, the people for whom work is a bigger reach, people who are further from the labour market, are the ones that really lose out. Because if people can employ, someone that's already got lots of experience and others, that is what they will do. And so you need to get to a low unemployment rate so that then businesses want to then employ people who are further from the labour market and give them more help. That's also what gets your wage pressure building and other things. So there's lots of reasons why you want low unemployment. In terms of policy about that, there's a number of things you can do. So you need different policies, basically. So you need to, the government has this kickstart scheme for young people, and the UK government creating jobs for young people that's just kicking in. Now, personally, when you're basically creating jobs, in general, those jobs should be targeted particularly at those that will find it hardest to get jobs in a normal labour. So for example, as you're saying, people that have had maybe 6 months out of work, not those that happen to have just lost their job right now, because otherwise it will just be displaced. Those people are probably going to go back into work anyway. But you do want policy to also support those people who have just, you want to be helping people find work quickly, even if they're not long-term unemployed. But when it comes to the more expensive interventions, those should be targeted at the hardest to reach groups.
Okay. If you're Rishi Sunak right now, and you're, I'd like to think, having some sleepless nights, what are the kind of 3 most sleep-depriving things in your in tray right now?
Well, I think it's quite, I mean, sometimes it's not easy to know what the priority for the government is, but this one's quite easy, which is, what is this autumn about? It's about unemployment going up and it's about COVID cases going up. And the job of government at a UK level and across the UK is to get both those things down. We need to keep the unemployment rise down and we need to keep the COVID caseload down. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, it means what we're now seeing, which is more restrictions to get our reproduction rate back below 1, so that we've got a sustainable position on the virus. And then on unemployment, it means a number of things. It means, one, that what you can't have is that you're ramping back up restrictions on economic activity and at the same time trying to phase out all of your economic support. So we're currently in that situation. That will need to change in the weeks ahead. So for people that are going to be affected by another round of restrictions on their ability to earn a living, we're going to have to introduce more measures to support them. On unemployment specifically, my view is that you need to do at least two things. You need to reduce the outflow into unemployment from the hardest hit sectors. So you want fewer people leaving hospitality, because I am not confident, unlike some other economists, that you're going to see a big kind of move into those people are not going to quickly move into other sectors. Now, there's reasons why they might do. They're young, they tend to be more mobile, but my anxiety is that British business is not going to be investing in the middle of this pandemic. Uncertainty is huge, with the exception of online retail. So they're not going to be creating jobs. One, this is temporary. So a vaccine should be in place, hopefully, by like next summer. So businesses are not going to reorientate everything they do to employ loads of people that have just come out of hospitality for that temporary world. So I think instead, you want to maximize how many stay, not working, but stay working in hospitality. And you can do that in two ways. You can have part-time working schemes. So you basically give businesses incentives to keep two people working maybe half-time rather than having one person full-time, one person unemployed, which is what we do in France. It's being done in Germany at the moment. I think we should do that. And we should also go further in the very hardest hit sectors where they're facing higher costs because of the pandemic. The costs of, all those screens you see around. If I'm a restaurant, the costs I have from having people more spaced apart, less tables in the restaurant. We should be offering wage subsidies that compensate for those extra costs, because if we can get the cost of labour down for firms, then fewer people will lose their jobs. So those two things would help keep people, it wouldn't stop, but it would reduce the outflows into unemployment. It wouldn't help, for example, the nightclub workers, where the nightclub is not going to open at all. So where the nightclub's not open at all, those policies won't help. And so we're going to see unemployment rise. But for the restaurant, it would encourage them to employ more people than they would otherwise. And then we need to, as well as slowing the inflow to unemployment, we need to speed up the outflow from unemployment. And that is about a whole host of policies, ranging from making sure your job centres are staffed and are working swiftly and are matching people to jobs. And it's about, in lots of cases, it's about directly creating jobs. And that does not mean like the government has to employ everybody, but it does mean in social care right around the UK, most of the work is done by private sector firms. But we need more people working in social care, whether they're employed by the state or they're employed by the private sector. And it's all paid for, more or less, by the state. So there's places like that. There's green jobs around retrofitting homes where we could be creating jobs that would aid the outflow from unemployment. And we need to do that in a way that matches it to where the jobs are being lost. So one of the things that's unusual about this crisis is the jobs are being lost everywhere, basically, because hospitality in the retail sector and the entertainment and leisure sector, they exist geographic. It's not like a shipyard closing. So you can't just put a new shipyard in place. You need to create jobs in a diffuse way that means that people coming out of those diffuse sectors can all find new jobs. And that is why social care and retrofitting of homes stand out as opportunities.
And if you are solely focused on maintaining the number of people that are in employment, do you have to forgo all of the considerations that we might have been talking about 2 or 3 years ago around precarity and the security of work and 0-hour contracts and the role of agencies? Are those all just so far down the list of priorities now? The goal must be on just keeping people employed.
So I think they should be up the list of priorities, because if you've learned anything from this crisis, it's that low-paid workers bore the brunt, not only of the economic cost, but also the health cost. So everybody today is talking about, moving, the message being, make sure you all stay working from home now. Well, loads of people can't work from home and never have been working from home. Retail workers, they've been bearing the health costs of this crisis all the way through. So we definitely shouldn't be reducing the priority on improving the world of work. That's exactly what we need to be doing. I think it probably changes the timing slightly. So like, is now the right time to introduce huge changes to your labour market? No. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't dial down our ambitions for the minimum wage to get rid of low pay by the middle of this century, this decade, definitely not this century. And we should be going further. People should have legal rights to know when their shifts are happening at least 2 weeks in advance. We should change the rules around 0 hours contracts. We should enforce our labour market rules much more vigorously. So I don't think all of that, I think, should have gone up the priority list, including, by the way, how much we pay our social care workers. Because in all parts of the UK, slightly less in Scotland, but in all parts of the UK, we pay most social care workers earn below the living wage. And that is not okay. And that is because of government funding. It's not because of anything else. It's not the market doing that. It's state funding. So no, priorities should go up. But yes, you probably want to think about the timing of when those measures are introduced. You don't do it today.
Torsten, we're nearly at the end of our hour. That's gone so fast, but I hope we've covered a lot of the issues that the people watching have asked us to explore. I have one kind of difficult question for you. You've only got about 2 minutes to answer, which is back to this idea of megatrends. So before the pandemic, the big issues we were expecting public policy makers to be grappling with were automation, the role of disruptive technology, and the threat of climate change. In 5 years' time, do you think those will still be the issues? Is this just a blip? Is the pandemic just 18 months of our life that we have to kind of write off and then we'll revert to caring about those big issues? Or is it fundamentally going to change the way the economy is structured for longer than that?
That is a very big question. I'll try to adjust this.
2 minutes, go.
I think the way to think about it is I'm skeptical. So one, the pandemic is just a massive deal. And I slightly worry sometimes when people are talking about, there's a tendency at the moment to write all these pieces saying, oh, there's a silver lining to the pandemic. It will help reduce climate change because there's no cars, or some people like working from home. I think we should just be honest, which is it's a complete nightmare. Like, people are dying, people's mental health is a disaster at the moment, and it's a disaster for the economy. So I don't want to downplay the pandemic at all. I think it's a complete catastrophe. I think in terms of its lasting impact on our society, I have more faith in the areas where it's likely to speed up existing trends or latent trends, rather than assuming it kind of completely transforms things. So like, will it end cities as the dominant drivers of our economy? No. But will it speed up the already existing trend over recent decades towards most professional workers spending some time working from home? Yes, it will speed that process up. So it's those kind of things. In terms of like how to think about the 2020s, then my view is the way to think about it, which is hard, is that Britain is basically going to be coming out of, it's going to be facing 3 shocks: the financial crisis, which we still haven't resolved all of, Brexit, plus the pandemic. And those things are going to be happening at the same time as 2 big transitions. One is the climate transition, which you rightly mentioned, which I think will be getting serious during the 2020s. And the second is the demographic transition, which is obviously all countries, we're all always aging, but the 2020s is when Britain starts to have a large population of over 65s. Like, this is it. It's now about to start. So those big shocks and those 2 transitions are what is going to shape the 2020s. And that is going to mean that it's going to be harder than I think people thought it would have been maybe a year ago. So like, this is going to be the decade of tax rises, because that's how we're going to have to pay for the impact of those shocks and the cost of those transitions. And we coming on the back of basically, 40 years during which time politicians have been saying it was possible to have tax cuts. So there's a big change to our politics.
Torsten, thank you so much. That's been an absolutely phenomenal and fascinating hour, and we're very grateful to you for your time. Coming up next in our Powered Hour series, we meet again next Monday, where we're doing our first panel format with John Nicholson, the SNP MP for South Oakhill and Perthshire, who used to be a CNN broadcaster, Tom Hamilton, who wrote the book Punch and Judy Politics, who Torsten will know well, and Katie Balls from The Spectator. They're going to look at the role of whether TV debates matter, and that's the night before the first US presidential elections. And then the next Powered Hour after that is on the 6th of October at 7 p.m. with Anna Soubry, who will be exploring what happens when a politician falls out with their political party. So you can register for those events now on the John Smith Centre website, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much and goodbye.